One of the things that I enjoy about walking, not the main thing, but just a small byproduct, one of the things I enjoy about walking is looking into people's lounges as I walk by, whether it's through village or town or even somewhere that I'm very familiar with. There's something homely or comforting about looking in to see how other people's lounges are decorated, what furniture they have, what they're watching on TV. Particularly at dusk, as their lights, lounge lights are on, but their curtains aren't drawn. Now, I hope that doesn't sound too weird, but you kind of imagine, at least I do, that what it would be like to live there. And I wonder if you could choose to live anywhere in the whole world, where you would choose to live. I'm guessing that most of us would choose to live somewhere different to where we are now. We probably live where we are now for economic reasons, for to be with our job, or where we could afford, or to get the kids into school, or there'll be some reason why we have the house we have now. Maybe it is your dream house and you can't imagine ever wanting to live anywhere else. But just suppose you could choose anywhere in the whole world and money was no problem at all. What reasons would you have for choosing where you were to live? Would it be to do with the view? Would you want to live by the sea? Would you want to be able to see the sea? Would it be cliffs or a beach? Would you want to be able to see mountains or halfway up a mountain? Would you want a really good view over a valley? Would you want lakes or trees? Or would the view not be so important to you? Perhaps it might be the local amenities. Perhaps you'd want to be near a shop. Perhaps you'd need to be near Marks and Spencer's, or near friends, or near family, or near a football club, or just near life. Perhaps you wouldn't want to be in the countryside at all, and you would far rather be happier in a town centre. I wonder if the climate is important to you. I wonder whether you want to be in a place that's hot all the year round, or whether you want somewhere that has snow, or is green, or is mild or temperate. I don't know. I wonder if it's the style of house. I wonder whether you want roses round the door, oak frames, or whether you want something new, whether you want a balcony or a patio or a big garden. What kind of place would you choose to live in? John talks about Jesus choosing his dwelling and choosing where he would live for a time, and he is using some shocking words. John uses two shocking words, and I want to explain the first word to you now. He says the Word made his dwelling among us. Now, I've wiped out the second word, which is more shocking because we're going to come back at the end. He talks about dwelling. Now, why is that a shocking word? Well, John is drawing on the Old Testament use of the word dwelling. After Moses has given his commandments, God instructs the people to look after them in the Ark of the Covenant, an ornate carved box to be held in a sanctuary in what we would call a tent. They called a tabernacle. God tells Moses this: make them a sanctuary for me, make a sanctuary for me, and I will, and there he uses this word, dwell among them. And this tent is called the tabernacle, the tent of God's presence. And all its furnishings are exactly the pattern I will show you. So there's it's important, this place where God dwells. He says, I will consecrate the tent of the meeting, and the altar will consecrate Aaron and his sons to serve me as priests. Then I will dwell among you, and I will be their God. So the word dwelling comes to represent the presence of God, which is symbolized by this inner sanctum inside the tent of the meeting. By day, there was a pillar of cloud above it, and when the cloud moved, they upped and moved the tabernacle with it. By night, there was a cloud of fire, and it all symbolized that it was God's presence. God was at the heart of them. He was their people, and they were his people, and he was their God. And the word dwelt is only used in this context. When Solomon builds the temple, he references this idea that God had dwelt in the tent, and now he invites God to dwell in his temple. Solomon said, the Lord had said he would dwell in the dark cloud. I have indeed built a magnificent temple for you, a place for you to dwell forever. So dwelling is a word that is used to represent the presence of God. It's only used where God lives. So when John says the Word made his dwelling among us, he is specifically saying that this word, Jesus, is God, because only God could dwell amongst them, so that through Jesus the presence of God is with them. Now, if you've been with us through this series in John, you'll be familiar with this idea that John is talking about Jesus as the Word, and that he's particularly trying to develop and show that he's God, that he's the Creator. You can find the other talks on our website or podcast or wherever you found this one. Now, also in the Old Testament is the idea that God's glory is where he dwells. Psalm 26 says, "Lord, I love the house where you live, the place where your glory dwells." In the passage in Exodus that we read a few moments ago, in chapter 29, where it talks about God dwelling, the verse before says this, "There also I will meet with the Israelites, and the place will be consecrated by my glory. There I will dwell among the Israelites and be their God." There is this idea that where God dwells, there is glory. The cloud covered the tent of the meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. Now, what do we mean by this word glory? We perhaps have a feeling for what it means, but what does it mean precisely? If you look it up in a dictionary, you will see that there are a number of ideas that gather around it, all to do with majesty, with praise, with something that's awesome and wonderful. So the idea of glory is the idea of God being honoured. It is his splendour. It is where he is praised. It is we admire him because of his majesty and his beauty. So glory is this big word that almost describes the indescribable, the wonderful, incredible, stupendous, beautiful, awesome presence of God is his glory. And John says that we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only. And then he uses an interesting word to contrast it, who came from the Father full of grace. We have seen the glory of God, and we've seen it in grace. The disciples who write the Gospels talk a lot about the glory of God and of Jesus. It is seen at his birth. You may remember the angels, when they appear to the shepherds, the angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. The splendour, the majesty, the awesomeness of God appeared to the shepherds on that hillside, and it startled them, it terrified them. We discover that when Jesus turns the water into wine at his first miracle, John describes this as him revealing his glory. And we see that in John 2, that he thus revealed his glory, and his disciples put their faith in him. There's something about that miracle that revealed to the disciples the majesty, the splendour of God. Some of the disciples were with Jesus on the top of a mountain when he was transfigured. His appearance changed, his glory shone, and they saw it, and they recognized him as being divine and different. And this again is a significant moment where the glory of Jesus is seen. John tells us that when Lazarus is raised from the dead and he is healed, he talks about Jesus saying this will glorify him. At the beginning of the story, Jesus says this sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, that God's Son may be glorified through it. And then after Lazarus has been raised from the dead, he says, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" The glory of God is seen in the resurrection of Lazarus. The glory of God, perhaps most startlingly, is seen in Jesus' obedience to go through the cross. In the Garden of Gethsemane, as he's praying before he is arrested and the day before he is crucified, he says these words, "I have brought you glory on earth by completing the work you gave me to do. And now, Father, glorify me in your presence with the glory I had before the world began." So the glory of God, the glory of Jesus is seen in his grace, full of grace. And that's when John uses the second shocking word, because the word became flesh and dwelt. Now, what's so shocking about using the word flesh? Well, the idea of flesh is in the Old Testament is of the dirty parts of humanity. The flesh is the word that describes the desires, the lusts, the bits that humans have that are not what God would have, the bits that perhaps are embarrassing or awkward or unpleasant about mankind. Our lust, our desires, our lack of self-control, our falling to temptation, our overindulgence, our self-centeredness, all of this is described as the flesh. So when John says the Word became flesh, it is really startling. It is really shocking. And that the flesh should be linked to the dwelling is unbelievable. How on earth could God come to earth, dwell amongst us? That's hard enough, but to emphasize that he came as a human being, he came as a sinful human being, is really difficult. So what does this mean for us? That God should take on the sinfulness of humanity and become one of us, born in a stable, in brokenness, in weakness, in vulnerability, tempted as we are, and lives and dies on a cross, rejected and despised. What does that mean for us? It means that we are loved, that we are precious, that we are significant to God. Jesus has gone to a huge amount of effort to reveal his love to us. He took on flesh and he's dwelt amongst us. God has loved us. Secondly, we are understood. By taking on flesh, he knows the difficulties that we encounter. He knows the temptations. He knows the struggles. He knows the things that we regret and are ashamed of. He understands our humanity, and in his patience and grace, he still loves us. And that reveals that thirdly, we are deeply wanted. Why would God take on flesh? Why would God become a human being? Because he wants relationship with us. He wants to restore us. He wants to redeem us. He wants to reclaim us. He wants to bring us back into Eden. He wants to bring us into his presence. And therefore we are valuable. It cost Jesus everything. Not just the cross, but the humiliation and the weakness of being a human being. Taking on flesh, he comes and lives among us. If we could choose anywhere to live, I'm not sure we would have chosen first century Bethlehem, Jerusalem, the cross. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only who came from the Father, full of grace. And finally, John says, and truth. This is the truth, that we are loved. It's not a lie, it's not a game, it's not a sham, it's not a deception, it's not an exaggeration, it's the truth. We are loved, wanted, understood, and valuable. Many of you will know the story that Søren Kierkegaard tells us. Søren Kierkegaard was a great theologian and philosopher of the last century, and he tells a story of the great king who has seen a peasant girl and has fallen in love with her. And he says to his advisors, how can I win her hand in marriage? How can I convince her to marry me? And they suggest that he just simply goes to the peasant girl's house as king, that he wears his robes, that his soldiers accompany him, that the trumpets blow their fanfare, that the knights of the realm are with him, and all his glory and majesty is seen, and the peasant girl will undoubtedly fall in love with him and marry him. But he says no. He says she will be marrying me for my position and my wealth and my power, and not for who I am. And so he persuades his advisors to let him dress up and lay aside his majesty and dress up as a peasant lad and to go and meet with this woman. And she doesn't know who he is. And he wins her heart. And then his glory is revealed. And Kierkegaard talks of this as the example of what Jesus is doing. That he comes in weakness, he comes in humanity, he takes on our flesh and blood, in order to woo us, in order to convince us of his love, in order to convince us that he cares and understands. He doesn't want us to choose to follow him when he returns in all his power and majesty, when the heavens are rent in two and every eye shall see him. No, that's too late. He wants us to choose him in his weakness and his vulnerability, and by faith accept him and receive him now. Max Lucado says, the Bible traces the story of the God who couldn't leave us alone. He couldn't leave us in our sin. He couldn't leave us alone in our fear. He couldn't leave us alone with our death. So God became one of us. He took on our form, our flesh, and most of all our sin. He took our place so that we could go to his. This is the story of the Bible, the story that will change souls. Jesus took on flesh to dwell with us. And I wonder what difference that makes to us. What difference does it make to our self-esteem and how we perceive ourselves and how we value ourselves and how we look after ourselves and how much confidence we have to approach God and to be in his presence? For he has considered us worth taking on flesh. And he has come to live with us. He's chosen humanity as a place to be. And how much confidence do we have in the future? That this God who has reached out to us has gone and prepared a place for us. And he who dwelt among us invites us to dwell with him for eternity. And how much does this dwelling of God among us influence our love for him and cause us to fall on our knees in adoration and love and thanksgiving and worship and wonder, and that the glory and the splendor of God should be among us? And how much does it influence us to care for others? Those who we live amongst are also the objects of God's love and care. Also the people he has come to. I want to use some words from Isaiah as a prayer. For unto us a child is born. To us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. God, we thank you that you've come to us as a child. And we who are thirsty come to Jesus. We come without cost. We will not labour on what does not satisfy. We come to Emmanuel, God with us. A bruised reed he will not break. A smouldering wick he will not snuff out. In faithfulness he will bring forth justice. He will not falter or be discouraged till he establishes justice on the earth. And in his teaching the islands will put their hope. Lord, we thank you that you do not snuff out the wick that is smouldering or break the reed that is bruised. And so we put our hope in you. Jesus took on flesh to dwell with us. What difference does it make to our self-esteem, to our confidence in the future, to our love for God, to our care for others? If you've enjoyed this podcast, please do give us feedback. You can email me at donald@scbc.org.uk. You can find other podcasts and other videos on John on our website, and also from other members of staff, thoughts and reflections and devotions for this season. May God bless you, and may you know he who dwells among you. Amen.